Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Chai Tea Tai Chi web show. I'm Dane Dormio. I'm here with my good buddy Andrew Brown, and we're joined this evening by a really awesome guest. I'm looking forward to getting into some conversation with this guy. I know we're going to have a lot of interesting things to talk about. Mark Tanaka is a qigong practitioner, yogi, energy healer, and and teaches energy healing, yoga, qigong, meditation, all kinds of good stuff like that. So um, he and I crossed paths in the qigong world, and we've had some interesting conversations so far. So I'm looking to continuing that trend. So thanks for being here, Mark. How are you doing this evening?
Great. Thanks for having me, Dane, Andrew. Good to sit here with you. I'm excited to have a chat, see where the conversation goes. And yeah, glad to be here.
I want to actually start with looking at the term qigong as a very broad umbrella term. It just means energy work or solo energy cultivation, and that
Right.
can mean a lot of things. Everything from internal martial arts to medical qigong to neigong and esoteric spiritual practices. There's a it's a very broad umbrella. So um, we Andrew and I come largely from a martial arts background, and
Right.
that's how we got into it. But not everybody gets into it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what you could do, a lot of what you do, could be considered qigong, even though it's not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
the traditional what people think of as traditional Chinese qigong. But it still falls in that category um, if you just are talking about energy work. So I'd like to hear about the specific kind of work you do and how you got into that. What's your origin story?
The origin story. So my origin story goes back to, should I date myself? Um, 96, when I left college, high school, I went to college at UC Santa Cruz. And during that summer, I had a buddy who just started giving me spiritual books. And the first one I read was The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, I think. And then from there, a bunch of
That's
interesting
Dan
things
Millman,
happened.
right?
Yeah, that Millen's
Yeah.
book, exactly. And I just ate that book up. I really liked it. And I don't even remember all the details from it anymore. But it kind of got me on this path where I went to college, and UCSC back then, especially, was a very, you know, spiritual place, I guess you would say. There's a lot of hippies, there's a lot of psychedelics, all that. There, the rec program had yoga, process acupressure, massage, herbalism. So I started taking a lot of these courses. I started reading a lot of books. I got really into the subtle body, actually. Also read a book called Hands of Light by Barbara Brennan. She had a school in Florida that basically down the line from core energetics and bioenergetics work. So it's kind of a Western energetics tradition. So I got really interested in all that. I started doing yoga. I was taking a lot of psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, and I started having these really blowout energy experiences, basically Kundalini experiences, where the life force kind of channeled up my spine and blew my channels open. And I was having what I realized now were like non-dual experiences, non-dual states of consciousness, going in and out of those. After a couple of times, I pretty much, I think, was kind of stuck in a non-dual kind of state where I could feel everything inside and out as if it was one fluid field. So I would start hanging out with people, and it got really uncomfortable because I could feel everything they were feeling inside their bodies. And I had to learn how to manage that. And luckily, I was, doing a bunch of Taoist practices and was reading books so I could contextualize my experiences. And so from then on, I began studying a variety of different practices and traditions. One, to keep myself sane. Two, because I was interested in spirituality. And three, I got really into the idea of healing and transformation. And I realized and recognized that a lot of these mystical traditions were transformational and healing practices. And being at UCSC, I was taking my academic courses. I started to kind of formulate my own ideas around the relevance of these types of practices and approaches and how they were important for the world. I wanted to design my own measure with too psychedelic and too out there to have discipline to do that. So I found a major called community studies that allowed me to kind of apply my understanding and my theories into the context of social change, which is perfect for me. And so I started to look at these practices in terms of their relevance and transformation of society. And this is a little bit before the whole like mindfulness and, you know, yoga boom. So it wasn't something that was widely talked about in, you know, I think in mainstream society yet. But I was kind of thinking about how these types of practices, by their nature, what I experienced was an opening of the channel system, right? Which naturally had a transformative effect on my consciousness, I noticed. And I started to relate to and see the world differently, right? Because, and I read a really influential book around that time by Fritjof Capra, who's the author, you know, I think it's for Tao Physics, Turning Point. And I particularly liked the Turning Point because he was talking a lot about the history of Western culture and Cartesian and Newtonian physics and this very reductionist perspective that we come from, and how he was pretty much saying, you know, Eastern views and perspectives provide an interesting counterpoint. And I would say indigenous perspectives, right, shamanic perspectives, because they frame things more in the context of relationships and systems and interconnectedness. So I was looking at these practices in terms of their relevance in transforming human consciousness for the function of social change. And I was also finding a lot of these techniques, you know, bring up a lot of emotional trauma, right? When you start doing channel practices, qigong, meditation, what I encountered was a lot of my trauma. And so I got really also interested in healing and transforming those things because I felt that a lot of, my theory was like, you know, a lot of things we're seeing in the world systemically, right? In our politics and our institutions and the way that our, you know, sort of corporate capitalistic society functions is a manifestation of the neuroses of our own psyche in a way, right? Manifestation of our own trauma. So I saw the relevance of these practices in context to the healing of our personal trauma and an opening up to more like sort of transcendent states of consciousness that would allow us to see the world differently and how important that would be for us culturally, you know, socially going forward. That was kind of like a long-winded intro to why I got into all this.
Hey, why did you go to UCSB originally?
Oh, UC Santa Cruz, UCSC.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I grew up in San Francisco, and college was the thing to do, right? I was a middle-class Asian kid. All my friends were going to college. So I'm like, okay, you go to fucking college. All right. I hate school, but I guess I should go to college. So I'll just cheat my way through high school and get all B's, which I did. And then I was like, okay, UCs are close by, so I'll just apply to UCs. I got into UC San Diego, you know, Irvine, Davis, not Berkeley or LA, but Santa Cruz. And then all my friends were going to Santa Cruz. I was like, I guess I'll go to UC Santa Cruz. Not too far, not too close, right? And the campus was really beautiful with all the woods. So little did I know I was, you know, walking into hippie land, right? Hippie world, which would transform my life forever. But yeah.
Well, cool. Well, it looks like you found your crowd.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was the crowd I was looking for, but yeah, definitely.
Well, there's some really big themes in what you were just talking about. One of them being the dialectic of personal and collective transformation, which is a big part of our mission, is to help more people establish these kind of practices for themselves, help more people establish a personal daily mind-body energetic hygiene practice of some kind, because so we'll be living in a world where more people are doing this stuff. And I've heard of a critical mass kind of theory being applied to meditation, where if a certain, if enough people are meditating, then it shifts the consciousness of the planet. So I think the same principle applies for qigong and other energy practices as well, their mind-body practices as well, that when we get enough people doing this stuff, then it reaches sort of a tipping point where the center of mass of the collective consciousness shifts.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. But I think the interesting thing for me has been kind of coming from that perspective. How can we leverage these practices to the maximum in terms of efficiency, right? To really further that particular cause? Because like you said, I think a lot of these practices have a tremendous wide range of applications, right? Whether it's martial or, just medical health, right? Well-being, and also spiritual alchemy. in transformation. And it's interesting to me because on some level, inherently, by doing these practices in any of those contexts, it transforms your consciousness to a certain degree, right? But the intention and view and context that we set for the practice also determines the way we practice it and what our goal is. So it can potentially influence the vector, right, of our development too. What do you guys think about that? Have you guys noticed that? Like, I mean, what's been the effect for you guys in terms of doing these practices, and how has it transformed your consciousness?
That's actually a very interesting question that I wanted to ask you about. Specifically, you mentioned having experiences that you later came to recognize as non-dual types of experiences. So it sounds like you started practicing and you noticed these things started happening, and later you learned what they were. I'm curious, when you first got into these energy practices, was that the kind of thing that you were seeking, or expecting, or if not, what was your motivation?
Yeah, I think partially, luckily, being Japanese, so you grew up in manga. I grew up in manga and anime. So for me, a lot of these principles and concepts actually were familiar because they were in the comics. I just didn't realize it was actually real, right? And so when I encountered the practices, and also because of some of my psychedelic experiences that happened really early on in some of the books I was reading, I had the way that I approached qigong and yoga wasn't as like an exercise. I understood that there were alchemical, like transformative, subtle body practices. And I think that makes all the difference, right? Like, and that's one of the beautiful things about like Chinese qigong and kung fu and stuff, is that hasn't been lost, right? We approach it immediately from the perspective that it's a subtle body practice, where yoga has been very diluted and colonized. So we contextualize it in a very Western anatomical language, which takes the essence of the practice completely out the door. Not 100%, because you still get the channel benefits, but not as much as if you understood energetics and practice it from that perspective, right? So yeah, for me, also, it was like to start off.
Yeah, the thing I've noticed in yoga classes is they don't really do the meditation part. I mean, they do the standing postures, and they might stand there for more than a few minutes, but they're not, the teacher's not really trying to instruct people on how to get into meditative states or anything like that. They're just saying, keep breathing, keep staring ahead, or close your eyes, do whatever's comfortable, but just hold the posture. Not, like you said, all that spiritual stuff that, I guess you could say, baggage that comes with yoga.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, in answer to your question mark, question mark. In answer to your question, comma, Mark. The speaking of the change in consciousness, it was kind of funny for me, because I had no idea about any of this stuff. I was, as I mentioned, I got into qigong through martial arts originally, and I was doing external martial arts for a long time since I was a kid, and then when I graduated from college and went to graduate school, I discovered internal martial arts. But I was just looking for new types of martial arts to do. I grew up as a rational materialistic atheist in the Bible Belt, and studied math and physics in college, and I had no conception of spiritual consciousness whatsoever. But when I started practicing internal martial arts, i.e. qigong, martial qigong, and just started moving slowly and breathing and paying attention to the sensations that were rising inside my body, I underwent a dramatic transformation in consciousness, what was essentially an elevated state, a non-dual experience that I had no idea what it was at the time. I wasn't seeking anything like that. I didn't even believe in that sort of thing. It just kind of fell out of the sky and landed in my lap, and I was like, where'd that come from? And that was what got me started on the path of understanding that sort of thing. But it really just came out of the blue, as a result of just practicing internal martial arts, martial qigong, the way it was designed to be practiced with, and my my teacher at the time didn't really emphasize the energetic components of it. It was mostly about movement and internal strength and that sort of thing. So I the three, what it comes down to is the martial qigong, medical qigong, spiritual qigong. They have different emphasis, but they're all based on the three regulations: body regulation, breath regulation, mind regulation, which all mind-body practices, you know, are based on those in some form. You really can't get away from it. So even if you, in my experience, even if you don't have the intention of creating this sort of experience, even if you don't have the belief in it, if you just do the practice and the circumstances are right, I guess, then it'll work. It's just, you know, it's just as predictable and empirical as any sort of physical science. And this is knowledge that has been passed down for a very long time and sort of forgotten about, but that's essentially what, as you said, the qigong is. It's the same practice whether you're doing it for performance enhancement and strengthening the body, or whether you're doing it for health, wellness, longevity, stress reduction, or whether you're doing it for spiritual cultivation and cultivating higher states of awareness. It's all based on just the same universal principles.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question. So how long did it take for you to make sense out of your experience after you had those experiences? Number one. And number two, how many other people who were your peers were having the exact same experiences?
Nobody else that I was training with had any. I didn't. I didn't. I was not aware of anyone. And for a number of years, it was a number of years, and then actually what happened. Well, actually, I want to answer the other question first. In terms of making sense of it, it's sort of a progressive thing, and I'd say maybe it's still happening. What really helped me understand it was when I started to study transpersonal psychology and the work of Stan Grof, and also integral theory. You know, which was like at least a decade later before I started to learn about any of that stuff. That really helped me understand what was going on. But when I wasn't aware of anyone else at the time. It was years later, but I started. What I did notice is that I could recognize other people who had this type of experience, and first I would recognize them through their writing, like certain authors. Herman Hesse being one example. You know, I could tell just by reading his novels that he had this type of experience, and eventually when I came in contact with the conscious, the New Age spiritual community in San Diego, I started to come across people, and sometimes we would just communicate through eye contact, like just make eye contact with someone, and I could tell that they had that type of experience, and they were in a similar place of consciousness. So I'd say it was kind of like a long time coming in from the cold and finding my tribe, in a sense.
All you had to do is go to UC Santa Cruz. You could have done it right then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, though, right? I mean, because yes, I think all of this, I mean, including yoga, all these practices have the potential of opening that up. But in terms of doing it more precisely and strategically, and also to be able to contextualize the practice and the effects, makes a big difference, I think. And for example, like, who knows, right? And not to say that finding it accidentally and through your organic process is less than or anything like that, because I don't think that's true. But as we're going forward, and as I'm thinking about catalyzing a transformation globally or something like that, let's just say, right? And if consciousness transformation is the primary intention to improve our society, for example, then it might make sense to be a little bit more precise and strategic about that. Meaning, if you taught view, right, or the perspective and the philosophy and the theory around it, and then because I really do believe that how you structure the sequencing and the practice, for example, the cues that you give, the instruction that you provide does change the effect of a qigong sequence, right? For example, like I could do a qigong sequence that's specifically about building dantian, or charging the internal organ system, or clearing, stress from the system, or I can do a practice specifically to try to induce non-dual states of consciousness in my students, right? Those things can be done more precisely as you understand the principles and if you have a particular intention. So I think when you put those pieces together, you can kind of have a more precise effect. So like, for example, instead of just one person having that effect of opening to non-dual consciousness accidentally in the group, you can take like 80% or 70% of the group there over the course of 6 months to a year, and then contextualize their experience for them, help them and make sense of it, and teach them the proper application of that and how to take it forward. Because when you have that kind of more specific context and instruction, I think you could do more with it, where someone could then just, who doesn't have any of that, might have that experience, and then you'd be like, oh, that was cool. What the fuck was that? And 10 years later, they might realize what it was, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I started with Tai Chi, like originally, and my teachers were national champions. So they were all about competition. It was actually, we also had a professional wushu instructor in the school. So we were very focused on competition and the form being beautiful and like your moves being large and like all that kind of aesthetics. And it took me a while because maybe starting with that idea in mind, it took me a while to like even really notice the magnetic feelings that you get from the practice. I think maybe probably a year or two after I started was when I started really noticing there was something different going on than just punching and kicking. Personally, my experience, I don't think I've ever had the Satori moment. I've had glimpses of it, maybe, where I felt completely united with like an animal I was looking at or a plant I was looking at, or the group energy kind of maybe put me in like a nice state where I was almost looking at myself over the shoulder and that kind of like watching the watcher. Those are the kind of experiences that triggered me to go deeper into the theory and more like reading about this stuff than just keep practicing, you'll get there. So it took me a lot longer than some other people, but I've enjoyed the journey, and it's not that you can always find it. I don't think it's something that maybe casually practicing or not really taking this stuff seriously, not practicing any of the mental motions that you should be going into this, not kind of ignoring them and ignoring maybe the dietary practices and just only eating McDonald's and sugar all the time. I think those things are part of getting to these experiences. You kind of want the dietary stuff. You want I've read about this, I've written about this, and I have a lot of thoughts on these ideas. And then you keep practicing, and one day you'll have that nice moment where you're like, oh, I don't have to worry about anything. I don't have to worry. We're all one. We're all together in this, and there's no separation. That's all a lie of just the concept of just I'm going to name everything and just I'm going to say that this thing is separate from this thing and this thing separate from this thing. And being in that mental state keeps you from coming to that unification state. Right. That was my experience.
Yeah, definitely. And the practice is great for that, right? I think because it's such a embodied practice, it kind of gets you out of the mind and it gives you that direct experience. So even someone who doesn't have the philosophical foundation can have that experience spontaneously as well, because it's going directly through the body and directly through our experience.
Yeah. Well, so my teacher, he talked about how in qigong, when we're practicing, we have this thing called the golden immortal qigong that we practice. And while you're practicing it, we get to a point where we're supposed to do the microcosmic circulation and just keep guiding with our mind. He says you don't have to do that in Tai Chi. In Tai Chi is different. They don't have that same qigong mentality. In Tai Chi, you should be focusing on keeping your body in certain orientations and keeping the sensation of your balance, your center. And just by keeping the principles, you will automatically do everything else. Where in qigong, it seems like it's more of a you guide yourself to the way instead of just letting your body take you there. I thought that was an interesting difference between qigong and tai chi, even though tai chi is technically just qigong.
Right.
Very different.
Something that I came to learn much later after the experience I described is that the meditation technique of Vipassana, which is supposedly the original technique practiced and taught by the Buddha, so the story goes, is it basically comes down to focusing on sensation. You just focus on sensation to the exclusion of all else. It's not activity that goes on in the mind, it's awareness of sensation, and this is the portal to perception. And when I learned about this and I took a Vipassana course, it made total sense to me, because all I had been doing when this happened to me was just feeling my body. I was just moving slowly, feeling my breath, feeling my body. I was feeling physical sensation, and it led to this non-dual transient state. And so I really think there is something to that idea that that it's just a matter of feeling the body, and that's at least one of the keys. But get this, this is kind of a pet theory of mine, I guess, because I totally agree that well, for one thing, I'm a big believer in you should figure out what you want and train for that. You know, you can even just with Tai Chi, you can, if you want it to be effective as a martial art, you can train it that way. If you want to practice that's primarily good for your health and wellness, then you can train it that way. If you want to practice that will refine your internal energy, then you can practice it that way. So there needs to be a match between what you want and the way that you're training, of course. And if you're training for spiritual consciousness, then there are certain protocols for training that way. But I also think there may be an element of what the best way I can think to call it is like grace or serendipity or something, because it's like everything in the universe really has to line up in a sense in that one individual when that experience happens. And so there's like, it's not something you can completely control. It's sort of like an uncertainty principle almost, where you can control certain things, and like putting seeds in the dirt, you can create the conditions, but it's up to the universe whether that seed is going to sprout. So I mean that, and that's in keeping with the way of the Tao, isn't it? Right? Don't poke at it too much, don't try too hard, just kind of set up the conditions so it can arise naturally. I think that is an important approach to keep in mind as well, and not be too serious about it. Like, I've got to have this end all be all experience that's going to finally make everything make sense, because that'll keep you locked out of it if you get fixated.
I think this is a fun topic, because there's so much room for different perspectives on this, and I totally get you on that, on the grace. And I think the older I get, though, like I'm becoming more structure based in a sense in my approach. Like when I was younger, I was definitely more flow based and just kind of exploring different things. And as I've studied different systems, I'm also seeing the distinct differences in different approaches. Like, for example, Taoist spiritual alchemy to me is on a certain level, as far as the way I studied it from my teacher, Jerry Johnson, and what I learned from him, if I interpret it correctly, which I could have not, seemed quite different in essence than, say, like the Buddhist path, right? Because the Taoist spiritual alchemy path had more to do with the golden embryo and leaving the body and sort of having the soul and astral travel capacities, which shows up in other yogic systems. But like in the Buddhist system, it's more specifically you're either trying to attain arhathood or become a Buddha, right? To have omniscience, omnipresence, dharmakaya, samvakaya, right? Nirmanakaya. So it's to me, it's a little different in terms of intent too. So I do think that approach, view, goal matters. And I would say in the Buddhist perspective, it's very systematic, right? Whether you're taking the Theravada Orthodox approach, the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, they have something called the Lamrim. So it's like step by step, right? They've kind of, and not that I follow the exact Lamrim process, but over time, after practicing more and more, a few different systems, I can see the reason why they sequence things the way they did, and that there is some intelligence obviously there and the precision of the approaches, right? So I think there's a balance between grace and also having more of a clear, and not, and granted, I don't think all of us come in with a particular intention, and it just changes over time. Like some of us came in because of martial interests or workout interests, and I think that's totally fine. But at a certain point, I think as we start to get clear in what we want to accomplish, I really believe in the refinement of that intention and goal. Like one of the first things I ask all my workshop participants in every single kind of yogic workshop that I've taught is like, why are you fucking here? Like, what are you doing here? Do you want to get healthier? Do you want to have spiritual attainment? Do you even know what that means? Like, what's enlightenment to you? Do you even know what that means? And most people don't. So they're pursuing something they have no idea of, when actually, if you take the time to study it, there are clear definitions of these different pathways and what they're for and what they're trying to accomplish. So we're often, just not there yet, or fucking lazy, and we haven't done the studies. Where in the Eastern traditions, you would take the time to really, with this teacher, break down exactly what it is that you're doing and develop an understanding while you're studying the particular method, right? And I think that's something that's very lacking in the West. So there's a lot of hodgepodgeness and there's a lot of randomness in the practice, which is not actually going anywhere. So I do get concerned about that, as much as my path has been more about flow and grace too, like exactly what you're saying. The older I get, I become more of a curmudgeon. I'm just like, no, people need to like get more controlling or something, Like I'm like, people need to practice more strategically, like. But
yeah,
can
I
you
like
be
what
as
you said,
soft and supple as a newborn babe?
What's that?
Can you be as soft and supple as a newborn babe?
Right. At the same time.
Yeah.
Right. And which I think good strategic practice develops that in you, right? Whether it's qigong or meditation, Buddhist meditation, ideally, I think that's what the goal is, in a sense, right? Is to allow you to enter into a state of unconditioned openness, right? In the body and in the mind, right? So,
absolutely.
So in Buddhism versus Taoism, so the Taoism has that idea of wu wei, like no, do without doing. When I've read of Buddhism, they don't really quite have that same idea. Could you explain maybe that difference? And because you're saying, let's go with you can have students that come to you and saying, I want to learn yoga, I want to learn this skill, but they don't really have their why defined very well. Now, the Taoist way would say, whatever, that's fine. Just keep going. Just roll with the freaking flow and you'll find your way. Is there a Buddhist version of that? It's a little different, more like, see where you're trying to go and just keep going? Or
I say I'm like, what do you call it? I'm non-denominational, so I'm not a Buddhist or Taoist, so I can't really speak for the traditions. I can only speak for what my experience and limited understanding of it is, But I would say, from studying Buddhism, I think my experience of it has been more like step-by-step and strategic in terms of their approaches, and they have a very clear system. That's what I loved about studying Buddhism over time, was like how clearly defined the systems are. So then I can use that as a reference point to look at other systems and compare what they're doing, And I would say that, I think to a degree there's always an understanding that people's development is somewhat organic, but then they try to, I think, provide a more step-by-step process within that, right? In the Buddhist system. And Taoist systems, even with the Taoist alchemy processes too, they were step-by-step. You start with the Dantian, you overflow Dantian, then you go to macrocosmic orbit, right? On and on in macrocosmic orbit. So there's a strategic kind of step-by-step process even in that. as well.
Yeah.
I think Wu Wei correlate in Buddhism. Man, yeah, I can't think of it. That's one of the things I do love about, I think, Taoist practice is the principle of Wuji and Wu Wei, right? And I've found references to that in some of the Indian yogic systems. There's one book I was reading that was referring to something called prana sadhana, where you open up the experience of the prana in the system and you follow it, and you allow the natural intelligence of the prana to unfold in the system, which liberates you spontaneously. Which I really like that, because I had a very similar experience to that originally. You know,
I think maybe a connection could be made in the sense that maybe Wu Wei could be compared to being in the perspective of the observer or the witnessing consciousness.
Right. That'd be the closest thing, probably.
And, yeah. I mean, because Wu Wei doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing nothing that deviates from the way of nature. And when you're in the witnessing consciousness, you are not doing anything. You're just witnessing it happening.
Exactly. So it would be the correlate to Mahamudra or Dzogchen practice in Buddhism, right? Like if you attain that state of pure awareness of awareness and you rest in that and abide, you enter, or like you perceive emptiness directly and you enter the path of, no more doing, as they say. Yeah. The stages, and that's the same thing. But it's not that like you just do nothing, but you've done immense amounts of cultivation to that point, and then the last step is the letting go, right? Yeah, of the doing.
So since we're talking about transforming consciousness, I think there's a really interesting line of inquiry about this regarding there are these ancient traditions, the Buddhist tradition, yogic tradition, qigong traditions, Taoist traditions of transforming awareness, cultivating spiritual consciousness using, shall we say, purely endogenous techniques. And then there is there are the various shamanic traditions from all over the world that approach a similar aim of expanding awareness and refining spiritual consciousness, and that make use of plant medicines in various forms. Or, I mean, sometimes they come from plants, sometimes from fungus, as you mentioned, sometimes from animals.
Chanting, dance, too.
Well, well, those would be the like endogenous.
You think?
Yeah, I'm talking about like exogenous compounds.
Like taking in a substance. Yeah.
Yeah. Whether they come from animals, plants, fungus, or whatever. And I just think, to me, there's not really a right or wrong about it, but I just think it's a really interesting line of inquiry about what are the trade-offs, and like if you pursue a purely endogenous route like Zen or Vipassana meditation, or if you what are the trade-offs versus making use of sacraments, or is there even a way that, I mean, because some people are purists and say, you should only do this, or you have to do this.
Yeah.
Is there a way that they can actually they can actually interrelate, and like the types of two types of practice can actually interrelate?
Well, that's the funny thing, is like majority of our teachers, right, were fucking hippies in the 60s and 70s, and they took hella psychedelics. And then they became lamas and Taoists and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of them had their initial openings, I believe, on acid or psilocybin or whatever they were, mescaline or peyote or whatever they were taking back then. That's kind of a known fact. Like if you talk to a lot of instructors and well-known teachers and you look at their history, like I found different podcasts and different conversations with people that kind of elucidate to that fact. So I think a lot of people before getting into more serious orthodox studies, engaged in psychedelic use. And I would say that was kind of my experience too, where I initially had these openings spontaneously with these substances that got me interested then into doing more formal courses of study to kind of anchor and stabilize the experiences, and then to be able to teach it to other people or induce it in other people, right? Because psychedelics don't always give you the day-to-day kind of discipline and capacity and building that comes with, day-to-day practice. It gives you more of like a spur experience. And that's what I feel like the medicine was telling me. Psilocybin was talking to me, and it was just like, hey, you've done this 4 or 5 times already. Go back and do your fucking practice. Like, stop coming here, And then right around that time, I started having a lot of bad trips. And I kind of had to stop taking the substance because I kind of felt like it was my time. Right. Yeah. And that was just my personal experience. But I think, there's no universal like good or bad kind of thing. But like, I do see a tendency sometimes, I feel like, with people who just rely on psychedelic substances, they pursue the peak experience and the high of the substance over and over. But some of them are not all of them, right? Because some people are working with teachers and have a structure and a community that are working inside of, holding accountability and doing really deep inner work. But sometimes people just pursue the psychedelic, and then they don't have any practice to anchor them in their day-to-day existence. And so a lot of times the opening or the realization is not integrated properly. So I think, some of the people I know who are in that world professionally with the psychedelic therapy world would agree with me that the integration is really important, the community is important, and guidance is really important if you're doing those types of substances. Because I also know people who fucking lost their minds, Yeah. And it's not for everybody. Like, that's another thing that's not talked about enough, is that how some people literally become schizophrenic afterwards and lose their minds. I've known several people over the years in the past, from my days, where a couple of them never came back. Like they literally lost their mind, and they never stabilized again. So I think that's a consideration. And I think spiritual practice in that sense could be maybe safer, but then it still happens for people who do spiritual practice too, right? So I think it's always a risk in that regard. When we don't have any psychedelic experiences, people who just do spiritual practice, sometimes there's the opposite problem of rigidity, where the spiritual practice somehow doesn't work well enough to help them step out of their ego constructs and their structures and their rigid patterning. Where the psychedelic is beautiful because it's so intense that it pushes you forcefully into a non-ego or transcendent state, right? Beyond your self-concept and your self-construct. And one of the things I experienced from taking psychedelics was that it's not just a mental thing, but your whole somatic organization also shifts. I'm not sure if you guys can relate to that, but like literally your channels and your chakras and your dantians blow open, right? So that's what opens up that non-dual experience, is the barrier and the sense of the body actually is reorganized for the time that you're high. And that's what also contributes to the transformation in the way that the consciousness is experiencing itself, right? If that makes sense. And I think that's one of the values in terms of how does, body practices like qigong yoga induce non-dual states. It's partially through removing the blockages in the channels so that the sense of the body actually dissipates, right? Well, and or the mind also stabilizes. So you go into a nirodha in the mental state, cessation in the mental state, and the body sense also dissipates. And you go into deep meditation, absorption, then the mind and the body are gone, and what's there, right? So that type of thing. So if you can successfully do that through your practice, you can transcend. But like some people are so stuck because of trauma or different things, just traditional orthodox spiritual practice might sometimes not get them there, or sometimes reify those patterns, right? Meaning like you can practice because of your trauma. Your trauma is what's running your practice. Right. So, for example, perfectionism is a trauma response, right, to being not unconditionally accepted and loved. So being insecure and feeling like you have to compensate by performing imperfection. Now, if that's running your practice is constantly reifying that particular mental state and creating a rigidity that doesn't actually help you transcend your sense of self in the practice. Your whole practice is being run by the need to be perfect and feel safe. Right. Yeah. So I think in those situations, potentially psychedelics can help. Yeah, go on.
Sorry. It's kind of like not accepting that you're already in that perfect state. One of the problems is that I've seen with, especially Tai Chi, like performance, we're so focused on doing this form exactly the way, the video says, or the best guy in the world does the form this way. I have to do it that way instead of just letting it be your way. Just letting your own style come out. But we're always so focused on copying the guy who says this is the perfect one. And it's like, no, that's not the perfect one. That's just the one he did that day. And he's really good. And they all almost look the same for him. But that's not you. You are different, and yours will be different than his. And like I like what you said there. We're already there. We're already there. We're already perfect. There's nothing we can do wrong. We should just relax and flow.
Right. And at the same time, when we have trauma and conditioning, that forces us to not be able to see that.
Yeah.
That forces us, like, we can hear that mentally and even get it mentally, but viscerally, when we have trauma, and this is where I think, trauma work is actually really important for spiritual practitioners, right? And Luminous Awareness Institute, in the school I teach at, our teacher Annalisa really emphasizes this too, I think, and Reina, and this is really important to actually work some of the trauma out when we want to, if we want to have a fully transformed experience, because when the body still, because it's a very subconscious thing, right? This material, it's not a conscious mind thing. The body holds an experiential sense and belief, right? And it's not just a mental belief, it's an embodied somatic imprinting of there's something fucking wrong with me. And often that's rooted in experience, because I do a lot of trauma, attachment, developmental, somatic healing work. That's primarily what I do now.
Oh, no.
After all these years, I spend 9% of my time doing that. I only teach like 2 classes a week on that because of COVID too. And this is what I do all day with people and with spiritual practitioners too. And this is often rooted in an experience where their personal developmental needs were not met. And that gets internal, and then sense of wrongness they feel in the process of their developmental needs not being met becomes internalized as their ego is forming. And this is my theory. And the ego forms this identity that there's something wrong with me, when the reality was there was something wrong with the relational dynamic and the lack of regulation and support in the developmental process. So if someone has something like that, you can't just tell them that they're perfect and okay, because their body says something completely different. It doesn't actually register. So then that thing specifically, I think often has to be either worked with really closely, or the practice needs to be powerful enough that they can actually transcend into that space of knowing that's beyond their trauma, right? And even then, often you still have to come back and work with the re-imprinting of the embodied experience in the body. And again, that's where I think something like qigong, tai chi can be really helpful, because what it does is it shows us the non-stuck, non-crystallized nature of mind-body experience, right? It opens up that pliability and flexibility in the system. So whatever ego state that you're stuck in, when you do qigong or yoga really well, you're able to have moments where you can slip out of that, right? So people who have depression, there's a whole somatic orientation that creates that state, right? The sense of deingness or, androgynous has a felt sense quality to it, and an energetic configuration and somatic configuration to it, that when you wake up in the morning, you refer to subconsciously, and you know that's you. And you're like, okay, I'm here, right? And the system's always reorganizing in these very predictable patterns based on what our conditioning was. And I think things like qigong and yoga and tai chi, and especially internal kung fu and practices like that, really have the ability to actually teach us new ways of configuring our system and take us out of that old conditioning. And that's what's so transformational about those practices.
Yeah, it's really about dissolving the blockages. The more you practice, you're just dissolving the psychoenergetic, emotional blockages in the system. I think we might have lost Andrew.
Yeah.
I want to make sure to ask Mark before we wrap up about you mentioned you teach workshops and you do coaching. What's a good way for people to connect with you if they're interested in working with you or learning more about what you do?
So you can always go to my website, which I need to update, marktanakayoga.com. Wearing, like being a modern entrepreneur, healer, yogi, right? Like that is, we're all wearing many hats, so it's hard to keep up with everything. I teach my yoga and qigong classes, which I only do 2 a week right now publicly on Zoom via breathetogetheryoga.com. It's a yoga center in Los Gatos. Please support your yoga centers. They're trying to survive, the ones that are still here. they need your support. So I teach my classes through there. I teach workshops through breathetogetheryoga.com, right, as well. I just did a qigong one for a basic qigong introduction. And I also teach at the Luminous Awareness Institute, which is a energy healing school, if you were to put it simply, but it's so much more than that. We teach non-dual meditation practice, attachment and developmental healing work, and energetics, and how to combine those things for maximum awakening and transformation and healing. Private work, my practice is pretty full right now, but if you want to connect around that, you can go to my website and go to the contact page and contact me directly about that. So.
Okay, awesome. Would you actually mind, after we're done here, putting your website in the comments on this video?
Sure, we'll do.
It'll make it easy for people to find. Awesome.
Well, it looks like we're wrapping up here. I did want to ask you about what some of the major differences between yogic breathing techniques, qigong breathing techniques, and maybe Buddhist breathing techniques.
Oh, that's a great question. That's a cool one to think about.
Let's get into it. We just kept talking about energy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Indian yogic system has really a wide array of breathing practices, right, for a lot of different functions. And I think the primary goal in the yogic system is for the refinement of the channels, the regulation of the breath, the calming of the mind, and also then the purification of the three central channels and the driving of the prana into the midline, right, in the Sushumna Nadi, the central channel. Mm-hmm. So as a way of entering cessation, right, and to induce a non-dual state of consciousness. So, and I would say in the Tibetan Buddhist system, when you look at practices like Tumo, Tselling Trokor, it's similar. They use a different set of practices. They primarily use inhale retention as a breathing technique. Inhale and then retention and compression.
And you pressurize your belly, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, as a way of kind of like pressurizing the whole channel system to purify the channels, and then to do something similar to a Dantian cultivation in the lower Dantian. So that's very similar. Taoists, the initial one I learned primarily was the Dantian breathing, right? So I kind of started there, and we learned some other breathing techniques like how to breathe in qi into the bones and into the organs and things like that. But I think the primary one we use is Dantian breathing. So that's kind of how I would categorize the differences.
Yeah, interesting point. I've noticed that in the yoga tradition, they have a lot of different breathing techniques, and they have all these different names for them. Mm-hmm. And then in qigong, they're like, there's like 4. You can do like a nose inhale, exhale, then a nose inhale, mouth exhale. Just little simple things like that. And I was just like, oh, wow, that's kind of funny how we just focus on this one Dantian breathing just over and over and just keep turning that out instead of doing
because in the Taoist system, because in the Taoist system, it's more about the qi. It's not so much about the breath, right? It's like once you get the qi, like the breath matters a little less, and you can move the qi with the mind. And I think that's where it goes, is my sense. But yeah.
Yeah, I've been experimenting with vacuum, vacuum exhales during my Tai Chi, and I just start pouring sweat after. By the time I'm through like one section, I'm just like, oh my God, I'm dying already.
Yeah. No, it's fun to experiment, right? I think that's my favorite, is like combining techniques, because we have so much access to different practices nowadays. It's kind of the danger and the joy of being in the current world is like we have access to so many different systems. We can combine them and really explore and come up with new approaches. Yeah.
Totally true. And I know there's a lot more exciting stuff we could talk about, but in the interest of keeping this bite size, we'll just say to be continued at a later time. And I'm sure we could pick this conversation right up and keep going with it. So hopefully we'll do that one of these days.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me, Dane and Andrew.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Mark. Thanks for everybody who's watching us. I see we got some live viewers. Hope you are getting some value out of this. And thanks for being here also, Andrew. I look forward to seeing everybody next time.
Great meeting you, Mark. Have a nice night, everybody.
Thank you, Andrew.
Peace out.
All right.